Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host for the week, Dean Detloff.
For the week?
Yeah,
hang on. Pause
just
the
for
podcast.
the week.
You're just for the week. You're doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably do it again next week, and I did do it 2 weeks ago. But I was just thinking last week. I mean, I guess I was still the co-host, but not live. So I felt like it was important to kind of mention it now. And this is one we can't republish as a result.
Okay. Well, in that case, I'm your co-host forever, Matt Bernico.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Bold. This guy's going to be podcasting in the Bone Church.
That's true.
We are not talking about the Bone Church, I promise, this episode. Disappointing the many bone perverts out there. But we are going to talk about other things, and things that are maybe even more unsettling and frustrating. Matt, before we get into that, though, we did both just kind of get through the experience of U.S. Thanksgiving happening in a country where neither of us live anymore. And what was that like for you guys over in Scotland? How did you guys celebrate your Thanksgiving?
Yeah, it was mostly, I mean, we thanksed, for sure. We gave some thanks here and there. It is very weird to have just sort of a normal day where you have to go to work and do things like that, and then you do get to celebrate Thanksgiving in the evening. But it's fine. I still made a big dinner, but we usually have tofurkey, but instead of having a tofurkey, we had some vegetarian haggis to go along with our Thanksgiving meal. So I had a little bit of a Scottish twist to it. A Thanksgiving dinner is basically just like an average Sunday roast for people that live in the UK. So the ingredients are all sort of relatively easy to come by, except for green bean casserole, which I couldn't make, which was very sad. Dean, what about you? How is it up in Canada, American Thanksgiving?
Yeah, same as it ever was, though I don't know if this happens to you in Scotland. It may just be proximity to the U.S. here, but people go out of their way to wish me a happy Thanksgiving, which I find very funny, because like people who know that I'm from the U.S., and it's very nice of them. I appreciate that they're kind of acknowledging that, it's a day of family and so on. But it is very funny to be like, thank you. Like, how do you respond to that in the middle of the workday? Just a great sort of reminder that you are and are not from this particular part of the world.
Yeah. No, nobody said anything to me about it until the day after. And I think that like they only knew because I mentioned something about it like in the work chat. Otherwise, nobody would have. They wouldn't have even clocked it as an important day. I mean, I get that.
That's great.
Thanksgiving is a colonial holiday. Land back, we don't like it. It's, Thanksgiving has like sort of bad white supremacist roots. We can all acknowledge that. Mm-hmm. But eating a bunch of food that's mostly just sort of carbs in different form is great. It's a great holiday. It's a great premise. And I think that part of it is very cool.
That's right. You know what we need is how Christians will have kind of just great alternatives to things that don't really need alternatives, like Reformation Day for Halloween.
Oh, yeah.
We need like the Reformation Day version of whatever it would be for Thanksgiving. I don't know what it would be yet, but maybe that's a good assignment to the listeners. What would be maybe the right kind of Christian left alternative holiday that we could celebrate every year?
I feel like this is a conversation that, it's happening now, but it's also like this could have been happening around the big Soviet planning table in the 1930s. USSR, what can we do to replace this bourgeois holiday with? How can we get to it?
That's right.
Comrades Day.
It's how Cuba got Don Feliciano.
That's right. Pretty good. Dean, this is great. I love Thanksgiving, but it feels like a little bit hard to be too festive for too long. Like you can have sort of a period of festivity, a window of festivity. You can open your window to festivity, but you know that after a little bit, that cold air of oncoming right-wing governments is going to blow in and really ruin your day. I don't know. It's such a hard thing to be in the Thanksgiving spirit, and now post-Thanksgiving, be in the Christmas spirit, knowing that there are a whole lot of Scrooges out there in the world who are ready to, I don't know, to kill Bob Cratchit or whatever the metaphor is actually. Yeah, I mean, like I guess we're getting closer to 2025, and every day closer to 2025, every day through Advent is like sort of the slow death march towards a Donald Trump presidency, which is bad. Yeah, I don't know. We've got Donald Trump in the U.S. There's going to be a right-wing government in Canada. you got that to look forward to yourself. There's all kinds of other like center right and right wing governments throughout Europe. Ireland had their election yesterday, and it looks like Sinn Féin was the second most popular vote, but the two center right and right wing government are going to probably form a coalition, so that sucks. And even over in the UK, where we have a supposedly center left Labour government, it's acting pretty right wing, if you ask me. So, anyways, I guess there's all of this new conservative energy, outright fascist governments, and sort of like liberals just like throwing their hands up in the air, and it poses a serious problem to, I think, the vibe of the season, which I think is solidarity. What do you think, Dean?
That's right. Solidarity is the vibe of the season. Jesus is the reason for it, but solidarity is the vibe. And
I'm always saying that.
I'm saying it. I'm going to say it from now until January 6th, when the wise men come give their great gifts to Jesus in a great act of solidarity. In the last several months also, I've been kind of feeling similarly despondent, or like it's hard to get in the holiday mood. There's just been a lot of bad news about really big things. And I mean, on the one hand, when is there not, right? Climate anxiety, it's there first of all, etc. But it does feel like there's been just kind of like a spate of like really annoying reminders that not that nobody is driving the ship internationally, but on the contrary, that some people are driving the ship and they're extremely bad and annoying, namely the United States and its cabal of insane genocidal freaks. And I think that has made it very hard to sort of feel not just festive, but I guess that there's like room or hope or possibility in the future. And I don't know about you, Matt, but I've just been thinking a lot about surviving psychologically the next 4 years of Donald Trump, and also how hard it has been to survive psychologically the last 4 years of Biden in retrospect, and just really feeling like, man, we've got to figure out some other path here, some other thing to focus on, and try to sort out what the advantages maybe of the next 4 years could be, the sort of things we could seize on.
Right. Yeah, it is such a frustrating feeling because, you know, it's not, the feeling is, I mean, I don't know. Everyone feels in their own way. We talked a lot about how people feel last week, especially John Pavlovitz, but people feel so many different ways. But my feelings about the past 4 years and the next 4 years are not like sadness. They're not like crying face emoji. There's no sad react, I guess. It's just like sort of frustration at how stupid it is and how like mind-numbingly uncurious and completely unhinged it is. Like there's never will anyone take the obvious answer of just like kind of be chill or do something good, listen to some people who might know. It's always just going to be like the most insane thing that you can imagine. Like, I don't know, we just struggled through 4 years of a presidency. I mean, it's still going on. It does seem like Joe Biden's dead, by the way. Can I just name that as sort of an elephant in the room? Joe Biden, he is not dead, and I have to kind of remind myself that every day that he is actually alive.
Ship him off to the Capuchins, stand him up in there, no one will know the difference.
Corn Pop's already over there in the Bone Church. But anyways, Joe Biden, who is alive, his presidency is not over. He could still do something sort of in his lame duck days, but he won't. But it's so frustrating because we've been dealing with that whole mess for the last 4 years, right? Hoping that we can lobby liberal institutions just to keep their own promises, right? Like Biden kind of had some promises with regards to Cuba, and maybe unthawing tensions around them again, like kind of going back to the Obama era Cuba policies. And I think that maybe some of the strategies around solidarity and building solidarity with Cuba was just like trying to push the government to keep up their end of the bargain, what they said that they would do, and they didn't, right? That's very frustrating. I don't know if anyone remembers this from the podcast, but I did, like, my Lenten journey one year was writing letters to Joe Biden to please take Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. And he wrote me back one time and said, no, LOL. And I guess it's just, that's frustrating. That's frustrating. Liberalism, as we know, is kind of all about that, right? Not sort of changing anything, but feeling good about that decision. It is a little bit different, though, moving into this new weird era. Not weird. It's like the new normal era of global right-wing governments doing things that are not like not doing things that are bad and like not trying to make anyone feel good about them, I guess is the thing. Like, where it might have made sense to write Joe Biden letters or to lobby his government to do something with regard to Cuba policy, it doesn't really make sense to say anything to Donald Trump. I mean, with Marco Rubio up in the business and Donald Trump out there, like, it does not make any sense to try to like lobby a right-wing government who is not like, not indifferent, but like actively hostile toward a place like Cuba or, a place like Palestine or the idea of climate change. It just like doesn't really make sense. There's not like any leverage you could really pull that would make them care. So I guess the question heading into 2025, this new horrible 2025, is like, knowing that it is now even worse than it was, what do you do to like build solidarity or to maybe have some kind of effect in the world? That's the question. That is the vibe that we need to answer. Or, I'm sorry, that's the question to the vibe that we need to answer.
Yeah, I agree. That is the question to the vibe that we need to answer. It is, I think, worth actually talking through some of the failures of multilateralism that have happened in the last 4 years, because I think there's a tendency to view the Trump administration that's coming in as sort of like uniquely uninterested in civil society or the demands of the people and so on, which is like true in a way. I mean, the GOP revels in, refusing to listen to whatever progressive people and so on. That's the brand. But I think what gets lost in painting things that way is that it has also been the case that the Biden administration has not been responsive either, and in ways that are somewhat more frustrating, because they try to say that they are interested or, they are listening or hearing what people are saying and affirming that they know what's going on, and still they are doing all these very bad things. And I think it's helpful to kind of recognize that the rot in the U.S.-led multilateral system goes to the core of the the big plant that is the U.S. and its kind of monopoly over global power. I think it's just helpful to sort of point out that, like, yeah, I agree for sure. You can like write to the Biden administration in a way that you definitely can't write to the Trump administration. But what makes it even that much harder is that like you spend a lot of time writing to the Biden administration or like trying to talk to people who could influence ostensibly liberal people to do the right thing. And that time ends up not having any, it's like, it's not a net positive. It's just like you've lost a bunch of time that you could have spent doing something else. And part of the silver lining in a weird way for me of a Trump presidency is because the administration just will not listen and there is no point in writing letters to it and so on. It makes it a little easier to be like, all right, let's sort of double down on the tactics and movement building that has to happen external to those kind of apparatuses and like see, what we could do either to build something powerful enough to make even a right-wing government respond, or powerful enough to pressure liberals or progressive people to move to the left. And by the time there is a kind of opening, when you do have to write the letters again, maybe the opening is a little bigger than it was before. But all that to say, I think it's helpful to like review how bad it has been under Biden in particular.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Before we do talk about all of those things, you used the word multilateralism a minute ago. And can you talk more about what that means for people who might not know?
Right. So you've got lateralism, and then imagine you have more lateralism, a multiplicity of it. It's basically, it's like an international politics term, wonky term for kind of spaces or fora that are not simply bilateral, for example, where it's like a relationship between two countries or two entities. So, I don't know, but like the bilateral relationship between the US and Cuba is one very annoying relationship. And multilateralism is kind of the assumption that if you get more people in the room, you can kind of triangulate those bilateral situations so that, for example, at the United Nations, you can get everybody except the US and Israel or whatever to say, actually, the blockade is very bad. And I think there's some importance to multilateralism as an idea. Like, it makes a difference to say that we live in a world that is very global and plural and so on, and we shouldn't just leave it up to like a handful of nations, or often one nation in particular, to call the shots in like the entirety of the global economy. So there's something to multilateralism that kind of makes sense as like an aspirational thing or in a utopic kind of way, and like for better and for worse, it is the kind of thing that we have to deal with, right? Like when we talk about climate change, it will have to be a multilateral response. Like at this stage, I mean, who knows what it will be like in 100 years or something, but right now the world is not ripe for, you know, global revolution. So all we really have is multilateralism, and in that sense, like, you kind of hope that multilateral spaces could be productive. But the hard thing is that multilateralism is also something that a lot of governments hide behind and kind of use as an excuse to not get anything done, and also use as a screen to hide the fact that we don't live in a multilateral world. So, I mean, the most obvious examples are things like I just mentioned, kind of votes at the United Nations where like the whole world says, oh, Cuba should be taken off the list. Something that just happened again for the, I don't know, 32nd or 34th time or whatever it was. In October, there was a vote at the UN where everybody except the US and Israel and Moldova abstained, but everybody else said, yeah, it's bad. The blockade is bad. They should remove it. So that's like a multilateral, I don't know, declaration. But we don't actually live in a world governed by those declarations, right? Because it's not binding. So the US just doesn't have to care. So all that to say, it's like multilateralism, I think it's an important aspirational goal. We should live in a multilateral world where lots of people can argue and talk, etc. But we actually don't. And that is a big problem. And there's kind of a crisis of multilateralism. The institutions that we hope could kind of rein in the dominance of one institution or one state just are not effective, not working.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's also worth saying, too, that the multilateral, I don't know, facade that does exist in the world right now. I mean, not to say that nothing's ever been done or whatever. You know, there are important things that happen in multilateral spaces. I guess I don't want to be like too critical about it, but at the same time, I want to be very critical about it because there is like sort of the multilateral the vision of multilateralism that exists in the world right now, right, is mostly a fantasy in the sense that like there are not just two countries or at least one big country pulling most of the shots, right? I mean, there are different blocks that have different amounts of power, but what I'm trying to say is that, you know, if the United States says something doesn't work, or it doesn't work for them, or they don't want to like deal with that, then it just like doesn't. And that's kind of what it comes down to. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's like a liberal fantasy about the type of multilateralism that we have in the world and the type of like world order that exists and the rules-based international society that we live in, right? It is one that is governed by the United States predominantly, and everyone else kind of has to just get in line for the most part, you know? Like, so for example, the Cuba vote is a great example because like you said, for the 34th time or whatever, there's this vote in the UN on Cuba, and everyone votes no except for the United States and Israel and Moldova, who doesn't say anything, really doesn't want to stick their neck out on the line. And like in doing so, like, you know, it just kind of demonstrates exactly like who really has power and who doesn't, and like whose voice really matters and whose doesn't. And it's not, you know, whatever, Moldova is not is not important, I guess, but the United States and Israel are. Yeah, I guess in that all ends up being quite important, especially with regard to like thinking about how bad it was in the last 4 years, because not only is there sort of like an unwillingness for the Democratic administration in the United States to listen to progressive people. I mean, in some cases, maybe they've listened a little bit, but held back in other ways. They also won't listen to the rules-based international order, right? They won't listen there either. So whatever, it can be the UN on Cuba, or for example, COP29 in Azerbaijan just finished up, and you know that is a multilateral space where all these different global world governments come together and say, you know, this is what's happening with regard to climate change, and this isn't what's happening. But again, like it skews in a particular direction. It's not to say that this multilateral space is like open and democratic and where everyone has an equal say, because that's not really how it works out. COP29 is, you know, following the COPs in general is always kind of like, it feels extremely futile because nothing ever seems to really get done. There's some small victories with regards to like disaster funds and other stuff like that. But sometimes, like this year, you get like some really frustrating results. So, for example, climate finance was a pretty big talking point, a big conversation that was happening at COP29. And global South countries were calling for 1.3 trillion a year to kind of go into this fund that would basically help smaller countries, poorer countries, developing countries, however you might want to frame that, become more climate resilient and do like the big shifts that would need to be done to cut carbon emissions in their own spaces and stuff, right? So that's what happened. And you might have seen a lot of like media reports where people were like really excited about this $1.3 trillion deal as an outcome of COP29, but it is like exaggerated and not told with the full throated truth. In a report that Debt Justice, which is a UK org that does lots of international stuff on climate change and debt and all kinds of things, a cool organization for sure, they released kind of like a follow-up report about what happened. And I'll just read a bit of it here because, I don't know, seems like a good idea. The final text from COP does call on governments, multilateral development banks, and the private sector to scale up financing to lower income countries to at least $1.3 trillion per year by 2035. That's 10 years.
Just in time.
1.3 trillion. Yeah, I know. Exactly. But they say it's a vague and empty promise with no tangible or enforceable commitments to ensure that this is actually reached. Rich countries have only committed to, quote, taking the lead on providing 300 billion of this. So 300 billion of the 1.3 trillion. Who knows, they say, will take the lead on the other 1 trillion. But even this finance can still be provided by private and multilateral sources. While 300 billion may sound like a significant step up from the 100 billion a year goal rich countries committed to in 2009, when factoring in inflation, it is less than double that amount. Outrageously, contributions from global South countries can be counted towards this goal, including multilateral climate finance attributed to lower income countries' contributions. This means that rich countries can wriggle out of the responsibilities to provide even this adequate amount. So you have the situation where all these countries got together and decided, like, let's work this whole thing out. 1.3 trillion a year, no problem. Us rich countries in the global north, yeah, we'll give you 300 billion and then you can figure out the rest $1 trillion of this, which is like so not multilateral. I don't know. It seems pretty lateral, if you ask me, where one group of people get to make one big decision and everyone else gets to be ignored.
Yeah.
Frustrating.
Or like multi-lateral.
It sucks. I hate it. Yeah, that's
Sorry,
right.
I spoke over you, but just to have a clear copy for the audio here, I was saying more like multi-lateral, so you can make sure to just kind of isolate that clip whenever you want.
Yeah, no, I'll get it in
yeah,
there.
I figured. I mean, it's the same with all these other spaces on climate. Like COP16 happened right before COP29 in Colombia, which was also very embarrassing. It was a biodiversity COP. COP, by the way, as we've talked about before, means Conference of Parties, and the parties are governments. It's like the UN calls all these governments together to talk about lots of stuff. And in this case, they talk about biodiversity at this particular COP. And it was so wild. These COPs tend to get less press, but in some ways they are, I don't know, not more important maybe than things like the COP process related to climate. But they are uniquely important. Like biodiversity is actually a pretty huge thing that we shouldn't lose and is also at risk, etc. So anyway, really important stuff. But what is wild is the way it panned out was so embarrassing. So this is a report from The Guardian on COP16, where they said negotiations were due to finish on Friday evening, but ended in confusion on Saturday morning after almost 12 hours of talks. Governments failed to reach a consensus on key issues such as nature funding and how this decade's targets would be monitored. Many were forced to leave the talks early to catch flights, and negotiations were suspended at 8:30 a.m. when fewer than half the countries were present, and the meeting lost quorum. Countries will need to continue the talks next year at an interim meeting in Bangkok. There's a lot of really wild quotes in here, by the way, and it's worth reading the whole thing. The article does a good job of pulling Global South voices, but I thought this one was particularly interesting. The negotiator for Fiji, Michelle Balikanakia, sorry, I've definitely pronounced it incorrectly. The negotiator for Fiji emphasized that many developing nations who did not have budgets to change flight plans were forced to abandon the meeting. Unfortunately, quote, Fiji is the only remaining Pacific Island country left or present at this COP. We came as a delegation of 10, and I'm the only one left. We cannot afford to be changing flights because we don't have the funds. So a pretty wild situation in general. Like, a whole group of governments are gathered together in Colombia, one of the countries with, a pretty impressive biodiversity range, which is also at risk. And at the end of the day, like, they had to quit, not because they did or didn't achieve agreement, but because there just wasn't enough people to keep talking. And another thing about that, it turned out that the private industry had like a massive turnout for COP16 pressuring negotiations. Another Guardian article was reporting that the food and beverage processing industry had 460% more representation, and the tech industry had 333% more representation at the COP, which is just absolutely bonkers. And the number of people present at this particular biodiversity COP was double the number present in 2022. So, the multilateral spaces are just not only becoming more dysfunctional and absurd and almost like Kafkaesque or kind of surrealist, but they are becoming spaces that are increasingly colonized by private industry. I mean, even in Azerbaijan, COP29, the convener had opened the entire conference by reminding everyone that oil is a gift from God. Not the kind of thing that sets a good tone for figuring out what to do about ending fossil fuels and so on. So all that to say, the multilateral spaces, they are not okay. They are becoming more and more spaces for rich people to just continue kind of messing with the rest of us.
Fossil fuels being a gift from God is such a funny theological statement because you have to follow up with the idea that, like, okay, now let's have a moment of silence for the dinosaurs that God did have to kill so that we could have this great gift. Let's just read. I've got a list of the dinosaur names here. We're going to read them off one by one. Each of them have a moment of silence. Right. Stegosaurus. Tyrannosaurus Rex. Thank you for giving up your life for us.
We'll just
so I can drive my SUV.
We'll belch one gigantic oil flame into the sky on their behalf.
Pouring one out for these real ones, these real dinosaurs that gave up their lives. Yeah, it just sucks. God had to kill them so that we could drive these great cars around.
Yeah. I mean, so those are two big ticket items that show multilateralism being in crisis. Cuba, climate change. The last one, though, which I think is probably the one that's been on people's mind the most recently, is the failure of the UN to basically do anything about the genocide in Gaza. But not only the United Nations, also the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, legal entities that are supposedly multilateral and important for establishing international law and so on. Just recently, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and the former defense minister Yoav Gallant, who has said some pretty insane genocidal things about people in Gaza. They issued these arrest warrants, and it's pretty wild because, so the court that all these countries have ostensibly signed on to say, yeah, we think they should be handling international law, they have said, all right, this is what we need in order to try to figure out what's going on, to try to figure out whether there's justice or injustice happening, which, first of all, is already insane. But, I mean, kudos to them for having the courage to do it. But what's wild is the response of countries around the world has not been a sort of ringing endorsement of that demand, and not even a commitment to do it, but on the contrary, a kind of extremely depressing and weak backing down from really endorsing the power of the court to even do that, which has kind of showed, I think, the ultimate failure of multilateralism in general. If you can't even call people who are likely committing genocide to stand before an international court, then what are we even doing?
Right. Yeah, exactly. In an article from Al Jazeera, it kind of lays out some of this in a really, I don't know, sort of surreal sort of way. A flurry of official announcements followed from European leaders stating that they would uphold the decision to meet their obligations to arrest Israeli leaders should he step foot in their territories. One notable exception is Hungary, whose prime minister is Viktor Orban, has promised not to arrest Netanyahu. And, whatever. That's stupid, of course. I mean, that makes sense. Viktor Orban, he's a bad guy. I'm not surprised by that, right? But then France also says, well, they won't really do it either. And the United States, they definitely won't do it either. And there was even like a very funny radio clip of Yvette Cooper, who is the Home Secretary in the UK, who was kind of weighing in on the whole thing. Somebody asked, like, would they arrest Netanyahu if he came to the UK? And she was like, well, it really just depends. It depends on the specific situation. I mean, who can say what's really going to happen? It's just it's a unique legal process that we'd have to kind of undertake. And it's just like, okay, guys,
if you stole a candy bar, maybe. I don't know.
Just like lots of hemming and hawing about something that is like The Hague, It seems like it should be pretty easy.
Yeah, it is pretty insane. Things are collapsing at a rapid rate, and it is genuinely scary. I mean, something that people talk about when it comes to these things, international law, multilateral fora, etc. A lot of people on the left, understandably, are basically like, these institutions are bad and dumb and controlled by capitalism, and you shouldn't expect anything out of them. All of that, I get it. Like, and I even agree. It's true. But I heard Francesca Albanese here in Toronto not too long ago. She's the UN Special Rapporteur on occupied Palestinian territories. She's been, she's been a very courageous voice, I guess, on the Palestinian cause, and really trying to get people to understand the gravity of it and so on. And she said in Toronto, people are suspicious of international law, and that makes sense. She was like, it's not really working very well right now, but it's the kind of thing that, like, you will miss it if you don't have it. And I think that she is probably right about that. It's rough. But the trouble is we don't really have it right now. And I think that's the big challenge. And I think, like, all these things, they're bad news. And they, as we said already, they are things that are already happening under a Biden presidency, ostensibly the kind of administration that you could hopefully pressure, or that's the bet that you could get a hearing from them in a way you couldn't from the GOP, and apparently you can't. And I think that is important going into the Trump years as well, is to be like, we're not really trading a responsive government for an unresponsive government. We're trading one unresponsive government that tries to sort of, suck up your energy and time by telling you that they might respond to you. We're trading that for a government that is at least giving you the permission to be like, yeah, don't bother. Like, don't call us, do something else. And I think that's going to be the key, is figuring out what is the something else.
Yeah. Actually, it reminds me a lot. Okay, this is just maybe out of left field, but the whole situation does remind me a lot of when I was kind of doing some work to organize with faculty members at a university that I used to teach at. And a lot of the time was just spent with these academics kind of mulling over strategies and kind of thinking about things like, how would we go about sort of really causing a problem for somebody. And because it was a room mostly of academics, the response was always just we just need to ask these questions and get the answers to them in an open sort of forum. And surprise, that didn't help. It didn't do anything because whatever. That's power does not care, I guess, is the moral of the story, is power does not care if you ask embarrassing questions out in the open or pointed questions. It doesn't matter. They don't care if you write them a strongly worded letter. Power only concedes to, power and organization. That's the only thing that you're going to get anything done with. So I don't know. It's just the situation is just frustrating, I guess. Right. One unresponsive government that at least feels it could do something. And the transition now to another government that will be unresponsive and just doesn't care and will also be awful. So I guess that's the crossroads. So Dean, what do we do then in light of these impasses that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, I think I have been trying to sort that out in my life lately, especially because, I don't know, I think a lot about international solidarity in particular. And there is actually some interesting advice in Pope Francis's Laudate Deum, which was an encyclical that he wrote. Well, not quite an encyclical, an exhortation that he wrote following up on the encyclical Laudato Si ahead of COP28. And I think we talked about it on this show. And at the time, we were saying it's a crabby papal document. Pope Francis is very impatient as well with the failures of multilateral processes to deliver on climate change. But he has an interesting piece of advice that I turn to a lot, and it's got me thinking now. So he says this: in the medium term, globalization favors spontaneous cultural interchanges, greater mutual knowledge, and processes of integration of peoples, which end up provoking a multilateralism from below, and not simply one determined by the elites of power. The demands that rise up from below throughout the world, where activists from different countries help and support one another, can end up pressuring the sources of power. It's to be hoped that this will happen with respect to the climate crisis. For this reason, I reiterate that unless citizens control political power, national, regional, and municipal, it will not be possible to control damage to the environment. I'll read a little bit more because, first of all, I think this is already kind of the right framing, but it might lead you to believe that Pope Francis is really just kind of like putting all his eggs in the basket of responsive global leaders who, like, if you had enough pressure, they would just listen to you and do what you want. Like you said, Matt, you would just ask the right questions and they would say, right, okay. But he says more than that. So he goes on to say, postmodern culture, very fascinating of him to say this, postmodern culture has generated a new sensitivity toward the more vulnerable and less powerful. This is connected with my insistence in the encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti on the primacy of the human person and the defense of his or her dignity beyond every circumstance. It's another way of encouraging multilateralism for the sake of resolving the real problems of humanity, securing before all else respect for the dignity of persons in such a way that ethics will prevail over local or contingent interests. And he goes on to say, it's not a matter of replacing politics, but of recognizing that the emerging forces are becoming increasingly relevant, are in fact capable of obtaining important results in the resolution of concrete problems, as some of them demonstrated during the pandemic. The very fact that answers to problems can come from any country, however little, ends up presenting multilateralism as an inevitable process. I think there's kind of two things going on here. First of all, the kind of bet that activists could kind of link up the demands between countries and provoke a multilateralism from below, I think is exactly right and very good. And we can talk more about that in a minute. That's sort of the solidarity vibe that is important to recover, I think, in the next 4 years. But also this idea that, he's pointing out the pandemic in particular as an example of where there are what he calls emerging forces. And he doesn't say exactly what those forces are. But reading between the lines, at least the things that come to mind for me are things like mutual aid, for example, where during the pandemic, people didn't rely on states because they couldn't rely on states to sort it out for them. So people figured it out on their own. There was also a sense that even in that kind of isolated period, people figured out how to keep talking to each other and kind of building relationships of solidarity, as challenging as it was. And that, I mean, we saw some of like the biggest protests for racial justice during that period, etc. And I think there's a kind of sense that Pope Francis is getting at here where it's like, if we recovered a certain sense of citizen control, citizen participation, and so on, it could also even enable, smaller states or states that don't have automatic veto power at the UN or whatever to kind of take their voice as a more important one. And I mean, for me, I think about Cuba in particular here, kind of threading all that together, right? Cuba, a country that invented its own vaccine, that donated its own vaccines abroad, and a country that is also constantly kind of presenting a moral voice at the UN among many countries that don't, that present a very immoral voice. So all that to say, I think like in the next 4 years, official multilateralism, the multilateralism of elites, is just going to become more annoying. The G7 is going to be annoying. The G20 annoying. COP30 in Brazil, hopefully the Brazilians can sort it out, but it will inevitably be annoying. It's just going to be like headline after headline of like Donald Trump talked to, I don't know, whoever the prime minister of Canada is at the time, Polyev probably, and they agreed to, I don't know, like buy more oil. Like it's just going to be the dumbest stuff. But in the midst of all of that, I think we have to kind of give ourselves permission to like I don't know, not get sucked in psychologically to the black hole of all those headlines and instead say, great, we can just forget about them for a minute and kind of double down on building that multilateralism from below such that we could actually figure out what it means to have citizen power and not kind of like passively wait to hear what elected officials do or don't do. That's like the silver lining I'm holding on to for now.
Yeah, it's a good silver lining. Something that was really difficult during the last Trump presidency was just like how completely draining the resistance vibe was to it all.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't mobilizing in a very positive way, and there's not like there was organizing getting done or anything. I mean, at least not at the sort of like I don't know. There were people organized. Don't get me wrong, but like, you know, by and large, there wasn't like the resistance to Donald Trump was not like a big one that was moving beyond like people being mad on the internet. And I guess that was just like such a time and energy suck. So it would be such a nice thing to be able to build some kind of like bigger solidarity project that was, you know, a bit more resilient and not so focused on like every single deranged thing that Donald Trump or whoever says, you know. I think it would be a great exercise for people who are activists or want to be activists or whatever in this like coming Trump presidency, or like, you know, whatever dumb right-wing guy you live under, to maybe think more expansively about like what that process looks like, or how you can kind of connect with other movements in the world, because otherwise I feel like it's just so much spinning your wheels and getting exhausted doing that.
Yeah, there's a lot of psychic damage for sure. I mean, I think there are some instructive things from how people organized during the first Trump period. Like, you know, you saw people really doing occupations of like airports, or doing a lot of kind of immigration defense, and really confronting white supremacy in a big way. Like, that stuff was really impressive. And it's not like that went away under Biden either. And especially, you know, the kind of response to Gaza has shown that people are still willing to come out. But I do think that like the opportunity that a Trump presidency gives in the midst of also a wave of right-wing governments across the world is to rediscover that sort of like shared sense of planetary solidarity. And I mean, it kind of reminded me of some other things we've talked about in the show in the past, like Tissa Balasuriya, this Sri Lankan Catholic priest that we talked about previously. He wrote this book called Planetary Theology. And just going back to kind of the notes from that episode, I think are really interesting. There were a couple pieces I wanted to pull out here from that that might help us sort of frame like what it would be like to discover those international links. So he says, for example, he has this kind of really funny meditation on mission and like Christian mission work and so on. And he says previously the kind of goal of mission was to like numerically or quantitatively grow the church, and that's like basically it. But now there has to be this kind of sense of justice attached to it. And when you discover that piece of mission, the people who really need the Christian mission are the people in the centers of capitalism, because those are the people who are causing the most suffering, structurally speaking. You know, maybe not like in terms of their individual desire or responsibility, but in the global system, that's what's going on. So Belisarius says this: Christian mission to Europe and North America is a matter of urgent necessity because it's these countries that do the most harm to humanity and nature as a whole. Exercise more power for good or evil, call themselves Christian and hence are more damaging to the witness of the gospel, and are more dehumanized, more alienated from the values of the kingdom, and more difficult to convert. Such a mission is less romantic, less satisfying to our sense of paternalism, and yet more necessary for the self-purification of the churches because they benefit from the exploitative social system of the first world. He says more, but I'll just pause there. I thought that was such a like profound thing to kind of think about, again, especially in light of, you know, Christian nationalism and all that kind of thing. Like, what's the sort of Christian mission to the first world that we have to figure out? And I don't think it's just like, you know, convincing people to like turn away from their right-wing Christian nationalism on like the ideological terrain. But I think Belisarius is saying something more profound, that there's a sense of what is coming from the outside, like the experience of, you know, suffering happening in the global south can and should kind of have a recursive effect on the inside of the global capitalist system to say this is where the liberating message of Christ really needs to penetrate and kind of get through. And I think that's something we can kind of hold on to over the next 4 years. Like, how does the sort of, open brutality of the U.S. government, for example, along with its right-wing allies, how does that provoke actually a kind of rethinking of what it means to be a Christian in these kind of centers of power? And I think that's an opportunity that we shouldn't just let pass by, or shouldn't get drowned out by the temptation to get, I don't know, sucked into news media doomerism.
Yeah, it is it's a great and prophetic word for sure. And but also there's a sense in which the same problem with multilateralism in all of these big international institutions the ICC or the UN or whatever, you could definitely see that same type of Western imperialist sort of chauvinism or whatever definitely process in Christianity too. All of these mainline churches that have fewer members in the United States than they do elsewhere in the world or whatever. They would take that so poorly. They would take it so poorly to have somebody from whatever, a different country from the global south or wherever tell them, hey, you got to get this Christian nationalism problem under control or something. But anyways, I don't know. I think Christians should be open to that. I think it'd be cool.
Yeah, he goes on to spell it out a little more, and then I also went and dug up some stuff from John Sobrino to think about this further, because I think it's true. Thinking about how to respond as the church in the North and how to kind of sort that out is important for those of us who live in this part of the world. And theologians in the global South, guess what? They've already figured it out. We just have to listen and do what they say. So Balisario goes on to say, a renewed planetary concept of mission and evangelism has to give priority to the fostering of relationships of solidarity among persons and peoples based on the biblical values of the rule of righteousness, the kingdom of God. The churches must be directly and primarily concerned with just relationships among peoples and in regard to nature, so that human life may be happy and fulfilling for all within the limits of our human capabilities and resources of nature. A new ecclesiology or self-understanding of the churches is implied by such an orientation. They're to be part of the movement of humanity to go forward collectively toward the kingdom of God in the course of the evolution of human history over time and space. The understanding of God's word has to be within this context. Worship should relate to this collective effort, should motivate, purify, and celebrate it. And I think that, like I said, is kind of the vibe to take into the next 4 years, that this is a chance to kind of renew that planetary understanding of what it means to be a Christian, which is to say kind of building those links of solidarity with people in the world, and to find a way to celebrate that as a form of resistance against, the kind of Trumpism that is trying to bury that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's cool. I mean, Dean, you're kind of in that world a bit more than the rest of us probably. What are good ways to get involved like that, or just be able to make those connections or listen to, I don't know, people outside of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, reading is great. I think more people should do it. But the thing that people really ought to do is find a solidarity trip to go on and go on it. There are so many opportunities to do it. There's tons of organizations that do it. Churches do it. Non-churches do it. I really feel like the reality of encounter is the key. It's one thing to understand that the blockade against Cuba is bad. It is such a different thing to go to Cuba and sit in a church with a bunch of other people, and there's a blackout in the middle of someone trying to explain something to you, and then that person is like, sorry, this just happens all the time. The power will come back on, don't worry. Or to be like, yeah, we tried to get this food for people today, but guess what? We can't. There's none left at the market. So too bad, you have to eat rice again and again and again. I think that those kinds of things are important. I think being able to really, I guess, just share life with other folks and be open to what's going on there is a unique thing. There's been even tons of calls from people in Palestine to visit. It's obviously not a safe time to do that. But I just heard a bunch of Canadian pastors who came back from a trip to the West Bank, kind of reporting on what they saw. And these people are old people, I don't know, people who spent their whole lives invested in solidarity and are not I don't know, strong, young, they don't have the strength of youth to like carry them through that challenge, but they went nevertheless. And I think that's the key, is like, you should just go see literally anywhere else. Like, ask them what's going on and what they think you ought to do.
Yeah, cool. That's a good idea. I'll have to take that advice somehow. It's a hard thing to figure out how to do, but yeah, I'm here for it.
We'll go. When you get your UK passport, we're going to go to Cuba 100%.
Oh, big time. Yeah, for sure.
I think, though, just in the meantime, when you can't just travel, there are a lot of other things, and reading is definitely one of them, and trying to figure out, like, what is the sort of call being made by people in the global south. And it's actually a natural segue here to talk about some insight from John Sobrino. He's a Salvadoran Jesuit who has written a lot of cool stuff. We've talked about him before. But he has a co-written book called Theology of Solidarity that's really good. It's on archive. You can read the whole thing for free. And he says this: if it's not simply aid from one church to another, nor an alliance between different churches in order to promote their interests, what is the specific element in solidarity? Further on, we'll analyze it in a more detailed way, but at this point, it would be well for us to single out the elements that have set solidarity in motion in recent history, so as to bring out what is specific in solidarity when seen from a Christian perspective. And he has 3 points here. He says, 1, solidarity has been set in motion when some churches help another church that's in need because it has taken on solidarity with the poor and oppressed among its own people. 2, these helping churches find out that they not only give but also receive from the church they aid. What they receive is of a different and higher order. They usually describe it as new inspiration in faith and help in discovering their identities in human, ecclesial, and Christian terms and in relation to God. And 3rd, through mutual giving and receiving, the churches establish relationships and make the discovery that in principle it's essential that a local church be united to another church, and that in principle this mutual relationship embraces all levels of life, from material aid to faith in God. And I think that is like a pretty good nutshell of at least kind of how solidarity has operated for Christians in a very different time, when liberation theology was kind of a common thing to see, where, you know, Christians were sending like delegations in droves to Latin America and elsewhere to kind of figure out what does it mean to kind of build a relationship with people in these countries. There's so many examples of like Catholic parishes, for example, having a particular relationship to a parish in another part of the world. Between Toronto and Chiapas, for example, there was a long history of Catholic solidarity. And I think it's those kinds of things to say, like, solidarity is about building those relationships that are, in fact, mutual. That in some cases it is material aid, like just simply giving money, you know, like the Cuba fundraiser that we did for the Student Christian Movement of Cuba. But that sort of act is also bound up in a recursive process where you find out, whoa, there's actually a lot going on here, and there's a mutuality there that is, you know, in this case, as Sabrina was talking about it, kind of shared through the faith in particular, but certainly not only that. But I think that's a kind of unique angle on how to build that bond.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing because, you know, whatever, you go to church and you hear about, we're fundraising for this or that church or whatever, our sister church in, you know, Guatemala or whatever. And sometimes that stuff seems so eye-rollingly cringy and just like, okay, whatever. But it does make a difference. And it is kind of a cool way, actually, to connect with other people. You know, sometimes maybe this is just my own, like, my own internal feelings about how I feel about church and fundraising or something. But I don't know. Maybe it is a good thing to get back into the practice of.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in Cuba, for example, like staying at a Presbyterian church in Havana, it was pretty cool to be drinking purified water at their facility that was made using a purifier funded by Presbyterians in the U.S. And they like told that story very proudly of a kind of, you know, cool relationship they have with people in their own denomination. And they provide that water to everybody in their neighborhood, not just people who go to the church. And it's like such a cool example of the unique Christian contours of solidarity. Obviously, lots of things to say too about, like, I don't know, you shouldn't only be in solidarity with other people who are Christian. I feel like that maybe goes without saying. But Sabrina here is talking about kind of the uniqueness, especially of kind of those relationships with Christians in other parts of the world. And I think that's an important thing to kind of think through as well. Like, our own faith is expressed differently, experienced differently in other contexts, and building that kind of solidarity relationship in a planetary way requires being open to even that unique kind of relationship.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you join us there on the old Patreon, I think at like $1 or $2 a month, you get an invite to our Patreon-only Discord channel where you can have, I don't know, all kinds of great conversations with us and with other people. It's a great sort of community of listeners that have cropped up around the show that I really like. I think definitely the reason we keep doing the show is because people, I don't know, want to hang out and listen and talk about the same things we want to talk about, and you can be one of them if you want. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Logical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't want to get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late.